Teresa from Resource on Demand, and I've been asked by a number of candidates and clients if I could put together some helpful advice around off-payroll rules, better known as IR35. So IR35 itself isn't new. It's been around probably for about 20 years, but for most of us hit the headlines a couple of years ago when it impacted the public sector, and almost overnight we saw loads of contractors laid off work, and hundreds of contractors just left the public sector altogether. And those changes that were made to the legislation back then are actually due to impact the private sector on the 6th of April this year. So there will be some changes to private companies and also to charities within the UK. Now, one of the biggest changes has been around who determines the status for the worker, and historically we've seen it being a mutual agreement between the client and the worker themselves, usually driven more by the worker because there have been some tax advantages through working through a PSC or a private services company or limited company. So those tax advantages of offsetting expenditure and stuff like that against corporation tax. But the biggest change will be on the 6th of April will be that it will be the client, it will be the company that's engaging the worker that will be required to determine the status of the worker. So that actually takes the power away from the individual themselves and puts it across to the company. Now, it's mainly going to impact medium to large organisations in the UK, and there are 3 criteria. You only have to meet 2 of them to be considered a medium to large organisation. The first one is if your annual turnover is 10.2 million or more, if your balance sheet is 5.1 million or more, or if you employ more than 50 people within your organisation. And if you meet 2 of those 3, you will be required to make a status determination status, which means you'll be determining if the worker will be inside IR35 or outside IR35. So if you do fall within that category, you'll be required to make this status determination, and I would recommend that you do it at the point you're creating that role, so that the role in theory can be advertised as being inside or outside of IR35, because you really only want to be attracting the right kind of people to that role. If a company has people already working for them, then you're going to need to make a status determination for those people that are already employed or already engaged through your business. Now, over recent weeks, we've seen some real knee-jerk reactions from companies out there, some quite high-profile companies in the headlines, in the news, saying they're just going to lay off all of their contract workers, wait until the 6th of April and see what happens. I've also had other companies that say they're going to make a sweeping statement across their whole organisation and say whether everybody's inside or outside of IR35. And of course, those blanket statements, well, they could actually have a detrimental effect on your workforce, because there will be some legitimate reasons that people are working outside of IR35, and of course if you suddenly put them inside IR35, they're going to feel that in their back pocket, and that it's going to impact the way they get paid, and as a result you might see that they will just walk off the project, and then you could be left with gaps in your skills and trying to deliver to projects. So I would say exercise some caution around making a blanket statement across your organisation. One thing that you do need to be aware of, though, that as an organisation, is that you have to be taking due care and attention when you're making this status determination, so you have to be able to demonstrate that you've taken due care in determining the status of any workers. And I want to touch base on some of the key points that a company wants to focus on. There will be some organisations that are already adequately set up to make a status determination, and there will be some companies out there who probably are not sure where to begin. I'll give you probably the 3 or 4 key things to consider, and then there is something I'll mention after that. So first of all is to look at, is it actually project based? So we know, for example, if you're engaging people on employment, like full-time permanent employment basis as a PAYE employee, there is a sort of a limit of 2 years. So if you're taking on temporary workers and they've been with you for a couple of years, should they really be an employee of the company? So this 2-year limiter, I mean, it's not a be all and end all, but it's something to be aware of if you're taking on contractors or temporary workers or anything like that. Once they start getting to the 2-year mark, could they actually be deemed as being an employee of the company, or certainly working inside IR35? Now, that's not to say that some projects will be longer than 2 years in themselves. And we work within the IT industry, and there are some very legitimate projects that are, because they're massive global rollout, that project will roll on for a lot longer than 2 years, and yet that contractor is working on the basis of being outside IR35 and quite legitimately are doing so. So it's just something to be cautious around. Is, are you taking somebody on, giving them ad hoc work, and that work can roll on and on and on, and it can go on for years at a time, in which case maybe that role would be suited to a permanent employee. Or are they working on a project basis where it's an absolute finite? So once that project has been delivered, there is no need for that worker anymore. Are there milestones? Is there a deadline? Is it on the end project being implemented and stuff like that? If it's a real project-based role, then you could again quite legitimately have a worker working outside of IR35, but it would have to be project basis, not once that project's finished they'll do something else and then something else and something else, because again they might be construed as being inside IR35 or technically working on the same basis as an employee. Another thing to consider is the mutuality of obligation. So because the worker, if they're working for a PSC or their own limited company, they are a company in their own right. So actually you have to have mutual obligations that go both ways. So for example, you as an employer, you're not obliged to offer work to a worker, and the contractor or the worker is not obliged to accept work. So it has to work both ways in order to be considered compliant. There also is a right for substitution, and this can be a little bit of a tricky one, because I appreciate that there are clients out there who've vetted their contractors to make sure that they've got the right skills, background, sometimes security clearance in order to carry out a job role, or to carry out a project rather. And if that's the case, they might not necessarily want just anyone coming in and delivering to that project if the original representative wasn't available. So there are some legitimate reasons why a substitution could be difficult, as long as it's not unreasonably withheld, and as long as if those specific requirements or those special requirements don't exist, that actually that contractor can have the right to substitute if need be. So it has to be a genuine right to substitute, or genuine reasons why it would be difficult to substitute, and again, ideally documented. And also, we're then looking at supervision, direction and control, and this can be quite a difficult one, because like the others, there's always grey areas. But in theory, a contractor who's working for their own limited company contract, who are deemed to be outside of IR35, should really be able to deliver a project in any way they see fit. So they should have absolute autonomy in being able to deliver that project, and also rectify any problems or issues with that delivery. So if, for example, you have a contractor working for you who you are directing and supervising and telling what to do on a daily basis, they will probably or most definitely be inside IR35. So a contractor really must absolutely and realistically have the right to just deliver the project against key milestones. Now, we often hear of situations where on theory it's been declared that they're outside of IR35, but the reality is far different. So if we consider the following situations, if you have, for example, a contractor who has to work from a location, maybe because it's sensitive data, so they're working in a very secure location. Now, they could be working alongside other people that are employees of a company. So on the surface of it, you might go, well, actually they're employed by that company, or they're working inside IR35. Well, that might not be true, because yes, they might have to work from a secure location, but how they go about delivering that project on a day-to-day basis is totally up to them. They're not being told how to do it and when to do it by anybody. On the flip side, you might have a contractor who can work from home. They're not required to be in any location, and yet they have somebody who is acting or behaving as a line manager, who's calling them and is giving them clear guidelines on how they go about delivering that project, including when they do it, how they do it, who they need to speak to, etc., etc. So on the surface of it, they might think, oh, actually they're outside of IR35, but when you look at how much supervision, direction and control the worker is actually receiving, they're actually inside of IR35. So it's just something to be aware of when you're making a determination, a status determination. And finally, as a company, you have to make sure that the reality backs up what you're stating. So it's all well and good saying a contractor is outside of IR35, but in reality, their working environment says otherwise. Then they would, by law, they would be deemed to be inside IR35, and then that flags up issues and potential investigations and all sorts of things. So it's really fundamental that everybody within that hierarchy between the person and making that determination, the status determination at the top, anyone who sits between that person and the worker themselves needs to be kind of involved in that hierarchy. So it's important that you don't have somebody at an executive level who's making that status determination, who then is removed from the relationship with the worker, who then there is somebody who sits in between, who's acting as a line manager, who's basically supervising that worker on a daily basis. So it's really important that everybody within that hierarchy, from the person making that determination right the way down to the worker, understands what their obligations are and what obligations need to be met on behalf of the company. Now, when we look at this from the contractor's point of view, again, we're really looking at the PSC. So if you are a worker and you're working through an umbrella company, or you're working on a PAYE basis through a recruitment company, this isn't really going to affect you. I mean, there are other things to take into consideration, but when it comes to IR35, it really isn't going to affect you. And the reason being is that it will be the intermediary, so the recruitment company or the umbrella company's responsibility to deduct your PAYE income tax and national insurance and pay it to HMRC on your behalf. However, a little caveat would be to anyone that is working through a employment agency or through an umbrella company, you just do a little bit of due diligence to make sure that they are perhaps accredited, or that they are meeting their obligations in ensuring that returns are being done and in time, etc. So there are some umbrella companies out there that might not be meeting the obligation, so it's just doing some due diligence around that. Again, if you need some advice on that sort of stuff, you can reach out to us. If you're working under an umbrella or recruitment on a PAYE basis, this isn't really going to affect you. So it's really about PSC companies or limited company contractors. So my advice would be is, if you're taking any new positions from this point onwards, is that you try to get a status determination statement at the very beginning. So understand on what basis that role is being advertised, so that you know if it's inside or outside of IR35, and then you can make a decision as to whether you want to accept that contract or not. For people that are already working at the moment, it's really important that you start to have those conversations either with your recruitment agency if you're working through an agency, or with the company direct if you're working directly for them, because if you're working directly for the company, then as the PSC you will be held liable if it turns out that the status hasn't been determined correctly, or you'll certainly be equally liable with the client. So if you're already working for a company and that contract is likely to cross over to the 6th of April and beyond, I would start to have those conversations with the company now. Don't leave it to the last minute for the company to tell you on what basis you're going to be working. Try to get that process put in place now. Make sure that you've got the status determination as quickly as you possibly can, that all of the contracts reflect the basis on what you're working, and more importantly, that the actual reality of the conditions that you are working in are reflective of what status you've been issued. So all of those points I made before about mutuality of agreement, not being under the supervision, direction, control, they all apply. If for any reason you're being given a status that you think maybe is in conflict with the actual conditions that you're working under, it gives you an opportunity to rectify that before the 6th of April, so that you can go back and have those conversations and then make a more informed decision about whether you continue with that contract or not, or come to a different arrangement, perhaps maybe going permanent. So it's all about starting the conversation much sooner. Like I say, please don't leave it to the last minute. What you want to be thinking about is, if you have any contracts, is getting any invoices that relate to old contracts in and paid for before the 6th of April. And ideally, new contracts are being put in place now that are fully compliant with IR35 before the 6th of April, so that any invoices going in relation to that new contract are going to be reflective of your new status that you've been given, or certainly the status that you've been given by the company. So again, start the action now. Really don't leave it to the last minute. Something for PSCs or limited companies to bear in mind as well, and this is probably a bit of a contentious issue, but no one, unfortunately, in this company is exempt from paying tax and national insurance. Doesn't matter on what basis we work. And quite scarily, I've been hearing stories recently from some contractors who've gone down the road of paying themselves purely dividends for the work that they've been carrying out. And one thing I would probably recommend is speaking to a really good accountant. Again, we can help you find accountants that are fully conversant with IR35 regulations. But it's about having those conversations to make sure that you're paying your tax through your limited company in a compliant way that won't leave you open to risk, and that dividends, which HMRC determine as being a genuine result of profit of the business and not in lieu of salary or income for work done, that you're paying workers for the PSC and paying dividends in the correct and appropriate manner. So again, just be very aware, because unfortunately this will be something that HMRC will look at if and when they may conduct an investigation or do an audit of you. So it's just something for contractors to be aware of, that profits really are a genuine profit, and ideally you should be paying yourself a decent wage for the work that you're carrying out for the business. So a couple of things there that hopefully you can take away that will help you moving forward. Like I say, start the conversations now. Either as a company, they should be looking at making those status determinations statements now, so that they can get their workers moved over to correct contracts and stuff like that. And as a worker, is actually having those conversations with your with the company or the recruitment agency that you're working through. Something to bear in mind as well is that if you do find yourself, whether you're working or about to work, if you have been given a statement and a status rather, and you don't believe that actually that is reflective of your working environment, is to make sure you flag it up as quickly as possible. We don't leave it for weeks before you mention it. Try to flag it up if you've just started a contract, certainly within the first couple of days. If you've just been given a different status or a status from a company, and again, flag it up with them if you don't think that is reflective. We're in an education phase, and it would be good if contractors and companies can work together to ensure that everybody's being compliant, so there's no nasty surprises. Now, if there are people out there not sure about how to go about declaring a status, Obviously there is the HMRC website tool. Again, it has its limitations. It's not the definitive answer for everything, but there are also some helpful tools out there. We have partnered up with a company that have created a tool all around determining status for workers. It's pretty robust, so it should actually be able to help you through the, understanding all the statuses and different variations that contractors could be working under. Some of them even come with their own indemnity, which ours does, and they also come with like an audit trail as well. So again, it helps to show that you've been taking due care and due diligence when you're actually declaring these statuses. So there are things that you can do to kind of mitigate making incorrect decisions. And again, if you want to reach out, call us, speak to us, or ask any questions, then please feel free to do so. Hopefully you found this video a bit more informative. There's so much information out there on the web. Sometimes it's just hard to pull it all together and understand how it all fits in, but hopefully this will help you to understand what the questions you need to ask, what steps and what things you need to look for, either as the person or company determining the status, or as the recipient of someone who's been told what their status is. So hopefully this will give you some ideas on what to look out for. And as always, please feel free to share, like, or email us if you have any questions. Thank you.